I'm thinking with Varun about how we might actually incorporate the elements, especially the 5 elements, into studio design. This is an interesting thought. You know, the first thing is when we make a studio, particularly in the West, we have this feeling that we want to actually keep the world out, that the extraneous noises of the world are somehow evil or bad and they affect the music, and so we have to have this blank slate. I mean, reverb is the best example of, you know, the fashion of modern studio design. We want to actually make an almost anechoic chamber when we define what a studio is. And so it's so dead that it actually affects the musical performance of the performers, you know, unless they're bringing in sort of artificial reverb and some sort of delay. Unless they're really good musicians, they can't actually do their best work in that studio, which I think is really fascinating. So we have this funny sort of idea that we're sort of at war with the elements. And that's because, of course, when, you know, if you're doing a song and then you hear the sound like we can right now of someone with their chainsaw or something like that, it may not sound quite right. But I'm also aware that some of the best recordings ever made have been in touch with nature. You know, and a great example would be the Paul Horn recording of the Taj Mahal. I think this is in the 70s. And this flautist turns up and he manages to get permission to improvise on his silver flute in the Taj, which is something like between a 14 and a 17-second reverb. And so no studio would ever patch in that reverb, but he's able to do something just remarkable in that. So that's my first point, that we can think of a studio as something beyond this tiny little space, then with another room that processes the sound. I think we can expand our concept of what it is. And if we do that, then we can start to think about our elements, and let's think about them one by one. Air is probably the easiest one to get in a studio, because the more air between the microphone and the source, the more life force you get in the recording. Now, one of the biggest problems with the sort of rock and roll ethic is that the microphone's this far from the sound source. And people love it because of the proximity effect, right? You get this sort of larger than natural sound. And that's sort of like a bit of an addictive sensation, but it's not natural. So the further amount of air we can get, the more the music breathes. And the reality is, even this far away a microphone from a sound source allows a little bit of anarchy, because sound travels through air and changes. So when you can allow that to happen, what actually reaches the vibration of the membrane of the microphone is really, really different. And the same note played when the microphone's this far away will sound actually quite different to how it would be if it's like that. So that's one easy way to do. And another way is actually what I would call, I have a particular studio technique that I love called the 3 fields technique. And so it's like I have something close, I have something midway, and then something as distant as I can get. And so that's how I get air. And then I have one of 2 options. One is I can time delay the response to the different microphones, which is correct studio practice. Or if I can get it right, I can actually have the feeling of being in 3 places at once and have a little bit of imperfection. And if that can be right, it's the best. So this is air, right? Then we think about earth. And earth is really, I think, in studio design, it's how we insulate sound. So how much do we want to bring back? Because I guess you could say for me, I mean, you know, I'm a composer mainly and then a part-time sound engineer. The thing I always love to do is sound a space when I go into a space. So actually I get sticks and I get stones and I hit the space to hear what the acoustic is like, and I sing into it. And that's sort of what earth does. We work out the balance between reflection and refraction in a space. So I think this is something to think about, to have spaces that reflect sound directly, and that as some sort of stones do, and then some things that are more like sands that actually just absorb it and bring it in. So rather than having this idea of what is the best practice in theory of sound, we can actually design artistic sound spaces for this sort of stuff. And it can be really, really interesting. So one great example that I've seen in some friends' studios is bringing out things, different types of carpets or different types of rugs or different types of actually surfaces on the floor. So you can actually have, you know, I guess you could say one section that is like a tile, some sort of acoustic tile, and the other section that is then wood. And then there's a carpet that can come over one or both of them. And so just that is getting like 4 different earth sounds into a space. Another thing that I think that plays a really big part of that is the earthy sound of what electricity does as it goes through electronics. And this is something that to me is an elemental thing. Like, I'm a really big fan of the analog stage, whether it's through analog summing or whether it's through actually just passing sound through analog equipment with nothing going on. So to get the best results out of a compressor, sometimes we don't need to actually compress it all. We just need to actually say there's this incredible sort of valve electronics in this compressor, or even FET electronics, and I pass it through and I send it out the other end, and I get something that's really beautiful. And I can actually combine the earth and the air by reamping. I can actually just get the signal, put it through some good speakers, put some microphones to those speakers, and then capture the sound of my studio and hear what it's like. So that's those two. Then we have fire, right? And fire is a really interesting one, because fire actually equates to allowing the fire that's in people when they play to actually be captured. And that's two things. One is actually allowing this space where we can be critical of the world if we need to be, you know, so to not say this is technically good or this is technically bad, to allow the inherent creativity of people. You know, my experience for myself and when I work with others is as soon as we're criticized, a little part of us dies. And so it's really tempting when you're the producer to say that's out of time. And my personal advice to anyone who's into producing is to very quickly make the call whether we can actually improve someone by criticizing them. And unless we can improve them a great deal, there's no point, you know? So we have to find a way to bring out the fire that's inherent in all music, because all music, I think, is like a purifying force. It just burns through the obscurities of the world. So, you know, we have to inspire musicians through generally praise and understanding of their music, and through empathy, the idea that we've tried to do something similar to what they're trying to do, and, you know, or that we have the skills to help them. Like it might say, yeah, we really get that song, but, you know, maybe that needs some sort of new percussion or some sort of new arrangement, and hopefully we can make that respectfully and, you know, find a way to sort of add to the piece. But then actually there's also, like, I think a technique in using microphones and in processing to bring out the fire, and that's to allow the transience of music to really shine. Now, unfortunately, we're in a period of the world's production where I think, in my opinion anyway, we overcompress music. We are a little bit scared of dynamic range in music. Now, for example, if I listen to a Western classical symphony, I can have a dynamic range of, you know, 60 decibels. You know, I can have something from like a solo flute to like the full orchestra playing, you know, triple F and massive percussion, and, you know, 20 brass players playing as loud as they can, and one brass instrument's really loud. I can get this huge dynamic range, and audio engineers really hate that sort of stuff, right? Because it's hard to manage, and they go home and they listen to it on their car, and it's like you have to turn it up to get from soft to loud or loud to soft in your car, and it seems somehow wrong, but it's not wrong, it's music. That's how music is. But we've got this idea that the format of delivery now makes us as producers change how we actually fundamentally conceive what music is. You know, so we make things that are soft unnaturally loud just so that they can work in terms of the meters on our mastering plugins, which is crazy. It's just absolutely crazy. So there's certain things that I find allows the fire to come out in music, and it's probably fire and air together when you think about it. One is to leave lots of headroom. See, if you actually leave lots of headroom, and I'm talking about recording at something like -12 and having a space that also allows this to do, then people know intuitively they can give more, and you can get more out of them, and that really helps. Another thing that brings out fire is to actually say with people, when the microphone's not this far away from them, they actually have to make it bigger. So they have to find some sort of inner fire to make that sound. And that's very much a Motown technique in the 60s. They used to put the microphones well away from the brass players, so you could get this punchy brass sound coming out, you know, like, so there's all these things we could do. Now, space is an interesting thing, because there's two things we can do with space. We can shrink it through audio plugins, or we can expand it through audio plugins, you know. And the best way to expand space, of course, is through reverberance, you know. But really the best way is to actually, what I already mentioned, to capture multiple spaces. Now, I have a technique I use whenever I'm recording like chamber music, whether it's Indian or Western. I have a particular microphone array I use. It's one microphone which is 4 microphones in one. They're subcardioids, and it gives me what's called an A format output. And what that gives me is a completely spatial configuration. So actually it's like my human ears are in the space with those guys. And I like to have a studio where this can happen, where there's enough ring in the space that you can actually place exactly where the microphone is, where your main microphone is. If you don't have access to that, a stereo pair, you know, and we all know stereo pairs from having bought Zooms or Tascams or something like that. But, you know, I guess you'd say the industry standard stereo pair is probably an ORTF, an ORTF, which was developed by French radio in the 60s, and that's an amazing stereo sonic pair. And an ORTF with some omni flankers is, you know, still very much a standard way to capture space in a studio. So if you're going to do that, you need a wide enough space to be able to do that and get this sort of magnified sense of width, which makes really beautiful recordings. And from there, if you use spots, you match your spots to the stereo image you've captured from your main microphones. And that makes space really, really good. The only thing is, if the studio design isn't so good, we have to do the opposite. We actually have to cheat the fact that, you know, it's not a particularly good sound and get in quite close, and that's also fine. I think there's also a way to do everything, and then we might use microphones with particular rejection patterns. So we know that there's sort of bad things coming off the side, and we just, you know, we might use, say, a hypercardioid or a dynamic, or even recording something like a Bloom line that gives us some parts that are really thick and other parts that aren't. There's all sorts of ways in studio practice to get space. Water. Now this is the hardest one to capture, you know, in anything. But I've seen several ways that studios actually respond to the idea of water. One is actually, I've been in studios that have water outside the space. And it's a very, very beautiful thing to have like some sort of water feature in a studio design. And this is because we feel this notion of flow. Actually, just before this interview, I was writing about this concept of flow. There's been a whole sort of, I guess you'd say, a theory of music in the flow state. The flow state is sort of like spirituality without the word spirituality, I guess we could say. And if we all have this idea that music flows and we flow with music and we vibrate with music, we can get what water does to us. So it can be a physical manifestation of water, or I think the most important is to have this idea of the impermanence of sound and music and actually bring it into the ethos of what our studio is. Because studios do this illusion that this is like a version that should last forever. Just because I press record when someone does this song, it's like it's the same every time I press play. Especially in the digital age, there's no degradation. It either works or it doesn't. But really, that person can do that song completely differently the next week. And then I've got two versions that are completely different. So we have to have the studio to believe wholeheartedly that music is ephemeral, that music is something that comes and goes, you know. And I don't know if it's the physical design or the mental design that does this. I think it's the mental design that really allows this. Because if we bring this idea in, it means the people we work with, there's less pressure on them because they don't feel that the world ends if they don't do their best performance. They don't feel that you have to auto-tune every note or like, you know, make a beat mover to make everything perfectly in time to come in. So we get this, the water brings out the notion of imperfection making better music. You know, anything that's too perfect these days is sterile. And I think we have to resist this feeling of making music sterile. It's really boring and it kills the life force in it.